A machine made its next move, and a man fell dead. Welcome to Sherlock File. I am your host, Julian Whitmore. Drop your location in the comments. I read every one. Thank you for joining me. Let's begin. The cab made slow progress through the dense vapor, its wheels hissing upon the wet stones, while the driver called warnings to shapes that emerged and vanished like phantoms. Holmes sat opposite Watson, his eyes closed and his fingertips pressed together. Edmund Vale watched him with visible uneasiness. "You attach importance to the pawn," said Watson. "I attach importance to anything which exists where it should not. It may indeed have fallen into the cabinet. Then another pawn should have been absent somewhere. Objects do not acquire histories merely because Sir Claudius supplies them." Vale shifted in his seat. "Sir Claudius is an honourable man. That is a social judgment, not a mechanical one." They reached St. James's Hall shortly before 9. A crowd still pressed against the iron railings, held back by constables whose capes shone with rain. Rumour had already enlarged the tragedy. Watson heard one woman declare that the machine had spoken after the murder, while a newspaper boy insisted that it had attempted to escape. Lestrade met them at a side entrance. His narrow face was sharpened by irritation. "You took your time, Mr. Holmes. The fog delayed us. Has the murderer fled?" Lestrade glanced toward the stage. "You may laugh, but there is the culprit, and there are 400 witnesses." The great hall, recently emptied of its audience, seemed larger and colder beneath the gaslights. Rows of abandoned seats faced a raised platform, draped in crimson cloth. At its center stood a chess table, and behind it, the Automaton of Alexandria. It was an imposing figure, nearly the size of a man, carved from dark wood and dressed in faded Eastern robes. A jeweled turban crowned its expressionless head. One brass hand rested upon the cabinet, the other hovered above the blood-stained board. Professor Harcourt's body had been removed, but a dark pool marked the place where he had fallen. His overturned chair lay nearby. Holmes did not approach the machine at once. He examined the floor around the platform, then the curtain, the lamps, and even the nearest row of seats. "You are looking everywhere except at the weapon," Lestrade complained. "The weapon is obvious. The circumstances are not." Sir Claudius Meriton stood near the wings, a broad, silver-haired gentleman, whose formal coat failed to conceal the trembling of his shoulders. Beside him waited Gideon Pike, the automaton's inventor. Pike was thin and stooped, with pale eyes and long hands stained by oil. "You built this?" Holmes asked. "I did," Pike replied. "But not to kill. How is it controlled?" "By a sequence of cams beneath the board. Pressure upon each square transmits the opponent's move to the mechanism. The machine then selects its response from a limited system of combinations. A calculating device, an imitation of one. It cannot reason, but Harcourt's vanity persuaded the public that it could." Sir Claudius flushed. The exhibition was legitimate. Holmes lifted the automaton's brass fingers. "And the dagger?" "I have never seen it," Pike said. Holmes bent nearer the wrist. A narrow slit was visible between two engraved plates. With a pencil, he pressed a concealed catch. The hand jerked, and a steel blade flashed outward. Sir Claudius gave a strangled cry. Lestrade seized Pike by the arm. "You designed the mechanism, and you alone knew its workings." "That blade is not mine," Pike protested. "Someone altered the arm." "Recently," said Holmes. He touched a screw beneath the wrist and showed Watson a bright crescent where the darkened metal had been scraped away. Lestrade's grip tightened. Then Pike had opportunity. "Several persons may use a screwdriver, Inspector." Holmes turned to the chessboard. The pieces remained exactly as they had stood at the fatal instant. White's knight occupied F7, deep within the black position. Holmes studied it, then looked beneath the table. "Who recorded the moves?" "I did," Vale answered, producing a folded score sheet. Holmes read it swiftly. "Knight from H6 to F7. Check." "That was Harcourt's final move," said Sir Claudius, and the machine responded by murder. A faint metallic ticking sounded within the cabinet. Every man froze. The automaton's head turned slowly toward Holmes. Its brass hand descended, closed upon the white knight, and crushed the ivory piece between its fingers. Then, from somewhere inside the cabinet, came 3 soft knocks. Pike recoiled. "Impossible. The spring is unwound." Holmes dropped to one knee and placed his ear against the wooden panel. The knocking ceased. When he rose, his face had lost all trace of amusement. "Lestrade," he said quietly, "open the cabinet, but let no one stand directly before it." Lestrade signaled constables forward. As they reached for the handles, a sharp click came from within, followed by the hiss of escaping air. Holmes dragged Watson backward, just before the doors flew open. A cloud of vapor rolled across the platform, stinging the eyes and catching in the throat. One constable cried out and staggered aside, while another dropped his lantern, which Holmes caught before it struck the boards. For several moments nothing could be seen within the cabinet but a confusion of brass wheels, rods, and coiled springs gleaming through the smoke. "Back," Holmes commanded. "It is not poison, but it may conceal something less merciful." The hiss diminished. Lestrade wrapped a handkerchief across his mouth and peered through the open doors. There was no assassin crouched among the machinery, nor any passage descending beneath the stage, yet the interior had been disturbed. A narrow copper cylinder lay split near the rear panel, and beside it hung a severed cord which trembled as though recently released. Pike pushed forward despite the constables. "That cylinder does not belong there," he said, "nor does the cord." Holmes held up the lantern. "But the knocking." Pike stared into the mechanism. "One of the governor rods must have struck the casing when pressure escaped. 3 times. I cannot explain it. You have explained enough to demonstrate that the effect was intended." Holmes pointed to the broken cylinder. Compressed air turned the head, closed the hand, and opened the cabinet. A final performance after the audience had departed. Lestrade frowned. "Then whoever fitted the dagger also arranged this trick. Perhaps. Or perhaps 2 persons have meddled with the same machine for different reasons." Sir Claudius gripped the edge of the chess table. "Why should anyone do such a thing?" "That," Holmes replied, "is more useful than asking how." He entered the cabinet with the suppleness of a cat, carefully avoiding the central shafts. Watson watched the lantern move among the gears until Holmes's long arm emerged holding a fragment of black thread. It was no longer than an inch and glistened faintly at one end. "Silk," said Lestrade. "Waxed silk," Holmes corrected. "Recently cut." He placed it in an envelope, then examined the rear panel. There, almost hidden beneath a brass brace, he found a circular hole. "Does this open upon the back of the stage?" he asked. Pike shook his head. "Upon the hollow pedestal. The electrical wires pass through it." "Electrical?" Watson repeated. "The lamps in the eyes," said Pike. "Nothing more." Holmes gave him a swift glance. "Nothing more in your original design." Lestrade ordered 2 men below the stage. They returned to report that the pedestal was bolted to the floor and that no person could have occupied it. Their search produced only a bundle of insulated wire, a discarded program, and a small brass key. At sight of the key, Edmund Vale made an involuntary movement. Holmes observed him. "You recognize it?" "No, sir. You looked first at Sir Claudius, then at Mr. Pike." Recognition, accompanied by fear. Vale's lips tightened. Sir Claudius turned upon him. "Speak, Edmund." "It resembles the key to Professor Harcourt's private dressing room." Lestrade took it. "And why should that trouble you?" "Because the key was in Harcourt's pocket after he died." A silence followed. Holmes held out his hand, and Lestrade surrendered the object reluctantly. It was made, with 2 shallow scratches near the bow, and a dark reddish smear along one tooth. "Not blood," Holmes murmured. He touched it to his nose. "Sealing wax." He crossed to the chess table and inspected the crushed knight. From among the ivory splinters he extracted a tightly folded scrap of paper, no larger than a postage stamp. Sir Claudius gasped. There was something inside it. "Not originally," said Pike. "The pieces are solid. This one was hollowed and resealed." Holmes warmed the scrap near the lantern until it relaxed enough to open. Upon it, in cramped handwriting, were 4 characters: K, B7. Lestrade leaned over his shoulder. "A chess notation, an old form of one," said Holmes. "King to bishop 7, an impossible move in the recorded position. Then it is meaningless." "On the contrary, impossibility is often the most deliberate form of meaning." Pike suddenly pointed toward the wings. "Where is Vale?" The secretary had vanished. A side door slammed somewhere behind the scenery. Lestrade swore and sent 2 constables in pursuit, but Holmes did not move. He remained beside the board, staring at the square upon which the shattered knight had stood. "You let him escape," Lestrade snapped. "I allowed him to choose a direction. And what good is that?" Holmes lifted the white pawn found earlier within the cabinet and placed it upon Bishop 7. From beneath the board came a distinct metallic click. At the rear of the stage, behind a painted column, a concealed panel sprang open. Inside lay a blood-stained glove and a sealed envelope addressed in Professor Harcourt's hand to Sherlock Holmes. Holmes did not immediately touch the envelope. He first examined the recess in which it lay, passing his lens across the hinges, the velvet lining, and the narrow catch released by the pawn. The blood-stained glove rested beside it with the fingers curled inward, as though some invisible hand still clenched the object it had once held. "Left hand," Watson observed. "Very good. And too small for Pike, too broad for Vale, and considerably cleaner inside than outside." Lestrade snatched up the glove. "Harcourt's blood is upon it. That is enough for me." "It is enough to prove contact with Harcourt's blood," Holmes replied. "A murderer and a surgeon might share that distinction." He lifted the envelope by one corner. The seal bore the impression of a black knight, yet the wax was dark green, identical to the residue upon the brass key. "Professor Harcourt prepared this hiding place," said Sir Claudius. "But how could he know that you would come? He may not have known. My name is fresh upon the paper, while the wax is several days old." Holmes held the address beneath the gaslight. The ink still shone faintly. Then he broke the seal and unfolded a single sheet. The message was brief. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, if this reaches you, the Alexandria has played more than chess. Do not trust the man who claims the machine cannot think, nor the man who claims it can. The white pawn is the first confession. The second lies where the king cannot move, and the third will be spoken by a dead man at midnight. L. Harcourt." Lestrade read over his shoulder and grunted. "Theatrical rubbish. From a theatrical man under genuine apprehension," said Holmes. "He expected danger, yet chose concealment rather than police protection." "Because he was blackmailing someone," Pike said suddenly. Every face turned toward him. The inventor's pale eyes had hardened. Harcourt collected secrets as other men collect trophies. He knew that wealthy patrons wagered privately upon these exhibitions. He threatened reputations, marriages, careers. "Ask Sir Claudius." Sir Claudius's cheeks darkened. "You exceed yourself, Pike." "Do I? Tell them why tonight's match could not be postponed." The older man's hand rose, then fell. "Harcourt possessed letters written by my daughter, foolish letters to a married officer. He promised to return them after the exhibition." "And where are they?" Lestrade asked. "I do not know." Holmes refolded Harcourt's warning. So the victim had leverage over his host, contempt for his opponent, and secret dealings with gamblers. A useful beginning. A constable hurried from the wings. "Inspector, we found Mr. Vale's coat in the alley, but not the gentleman. There was blood on the gate." Watson moved at once, but Holmes caught his sleeve. "Was there much blood?" "Only a streak, sir." "Well, then Vale wished you to believe him injured, or someone wished to make you believe it." They followed the constable through the stage door into a narrow passage between brick walls. Fog pressed low over the paving stones. Vale's torn coat hung upon an iron spike, one sleeve darkened at the cuff. Holmes touched the stain, smelled it, and rubbed it between his fingers. "Animal blood," he said. "Fresh, but already cold when applied." Lestrade's expression sharpened. He planned his escape, or was instructed to perform one. Near the gate, Holmes found a faint line drawn through the mud, parallel to the wall. It ended beside a drain, where a scrap of paper had lodged beneath the grating. Watson retrieved it with his cane. The fragment bore part of a printed advertisement. "More. Midnight demonstration. King Street." Pike glanced at it and turned away too quickly. Holmes saw him. "You know the place. It is Moriarty's mechanical rooms," Pike admitted. "A private workshop off King Street. No relation to the mathematician, so far as I know. Harcourt sometimes held secret games there." "At midnight?" Watson asked. "Only for invited patrons." Holmes checked his watch. "We have 1 hour and 14 minutes. Lestrade called for a cab, but Holmes remained beneath the stage door lamp, studying Vale's abandoned coat. From its inner seam he drew a strand of waxed black silk, matching the fragment found inside the automaton. "Now we know why our secretary fled," said Lestrade. "No," Holmes answered softly. "We know only that someone wished us to follow him." A muffled sound came from beyond the fog-bound wall, followed by the rapid clop of retreating hooves. Holmes sprang through the gate. A closed carriage was already vanishing at the far end of the street. Upon the wet pavement lay Edmund Vale, bound at wrists and ankles. Pinned to his waistcoat by a white chess bishop was a card bearing 6 words: "The dead man makes the next move," and from the hall behind us, a clock began striking 11. Watson knelt beside Vale and cut the cords from his wrists, while Lestrade examined the white bishop fastening the card to his waistcoat. The secretary's breathing was shallow, but no wound could be found upon him. A pungent sweetness clung to his collar. "Chloroform," Watson said. "He has been insensible, though not for long." Holmes took the bishop from Lestrade and held it beneath the lamp. Unlike the broken knight, it was made not of ivory, but of painted boxwood. A narrow groove ran around its base. "A common club piece," said Lestrade. "Common objects are often selected because no one records their origin." Holmes twisted the base. It opened upon a tiny coil of paper, but the cavity was empty. Vale stirred beneath Watson's hand. His eyes opened wildly, and he struggled to rise. "The carriage," he whispered. "Stop it. It has gone," said Holmes. "Tell us why you ran." Vale pressed both palms to his temples. "I saw a man behind the painted column when the panel opened. Brown coat, low hat. The same man who followed me earlier. He signaled toward the passage, and I thought he meant to show me something. I was a fool. You followed him willingly?" "For a few yards. Then someone seized me from behind. There was a cloth over my face. I remember wheels and a voice asking where Harcourt had hidden the second confession." "Man or woman?" Holmes asked. "I cannot say. It was muffled. Accent? English. Educated. Yet each sentence came slowly, as though read from a page." Holmes' gaze shifted to Pike. "A mechanical voice?" Pike bristled. "You cannot suggest that I arranged this. I suggest nothing. I collect." Vale clutched Holmes's sleeve. "They searched my coat. They wanted the score sheet." Holmes glanced toward the folded record still protruding from his own pocket. "Then they failed. Or believed they succeeded," murmured Watson. Holmes gave him a quick look of approval. Sir Claudius had remained in the doorway, his face drawn beneath the gaslight. "This must end. My daughter is alone at Meryton House. If Harcourt's enemies know of those letters—" "You feared scandal more than his life," Pike said. Sir Claudius crossed the alley in 2 strides and struck him. Pike reeled against the wall, his pale face suddenly transformed by hatred. Lestrade stepped between them. "Enough. Both of you had cause to silence Harcourt, and neither leaves my sight." Holmes crouched where Vale had lain. The wet stones showed 2 parallel wheel marks, but between them appeared a scattering of pale grains. He gathered several upon his glove and tasted one with the tip of his tongue. "Plaster," said he, "freshly ground." "From the scenery?" Watson asked. "No. This contains powdered brick and horsehair. Building plaster, carried upon the carriage floor." He walked to the gate, measuring the wheel tracks with his cane. A narrow brougham, heavily loaded on the left side, drawn by a horse, recently shod in front. It did not come from King Street. Lestrade stared. "How can you know its direction? The left wheel bears grey clay, the right black soot. Those soils lie together near the demolition works north of Oxford Street. Our kidnappers approached from there." "But the card points us toward the mechanical rooms," said Watson. "Exactly. A signpost is useful, chiefly when one wishes travelers to take a particular road." The hall clock finished its 11th stroke. Holmes consulted Harcourt's letter again. "The second lies where the king cannot move," he read. "The third will be spoken by a dead man at midnight." Pike's expression changed. "There is one place Harcourt called the King's Prison." Sir Claudius looked sharply at him. "Moriarty's rooms," Pike continued. "Beneath the demonstration chamber is a sealed chess vault. Harcourt kept records of private wagers there. The central square is occupied by an iron king fixed to the floor. It cannot move." Lestrade smiled grimly. "Then we go to King Street." "We go," said Holmes, "but not all together." He gave rapid instructions. Lestrade and 2 constables would take the front entrance. Sir Claudius was to remain under guard. Pike would accompany Holmes and Watson through a yard behind the building, since he knew the workshop's construction. Vale, despite his protests, was placed in a cab bound for Baker Street. As the cab pulled away, Holmes leaned through its window. "Whatever happens, Do not remove your boots. Vale stared at him, bewildered. Holmes offered no explanation. 20 minutes later, they entered King Street, where warehouses loomed through the fog like black cliffs. At the far end stood a narrow building without lamps or signboard. Yet from somewhere within came the measured clicking of a chess clock. Then, precisely as midnight began to strike, a dead man's voice called Holmes by name from the darkness. The voice came again, thin and metallic, from somewhere above the doorway. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, you are late by 7 minutes." Watson felt Pike seize his arm. The inventor's breath came sharply through his teeth. "That is Harcourt," he whispered. "I would swear to it." Holmes raised his lantern. Beneath the eaves, half concealed by soot, a brass trumpet projected from the wall. A wire descended from it through a cracked window frame. "A phonograph," said Holmes. "The dead gentleman has merely kept his appointment." As the 12th stroke faded, the mechanism within the building clicked, and Harcourt's recorded voice continued. "The second confession lies beneath the imprisoned king. Take care, however. One player has already altered the board." A heavy bolt withdrew inside the door. Holmes did not enter. He placed the lantern upon the pavement and examined the threshold. A nearly invisible black thread stretched across it at ankle height. "Waxed silk again," Watson murmured. Holmes cut it with his pocket knife. From within came the snap of a released spring, followed by the crash of iron somewhere in the darkness. "An admirable welcome," said he. "Had we crossed without looking, the game would have ended quickly." Pike unlocked a side gate, and they entered a yard crowded with broken cabinets and rusting machinery. Lestrade's men could be heard forcing the front entrance. Holmes found a low window, prized it open, and climbed into the workshop. The room smelled of oil, damp wood, and hot metal. Rows of unfinished mechanical figures stood beneath dust sheets, their shapes resembling silent spectators. At the center rested a long table carrying gears, chessmen, and copper wire. One gas jet burned low, though Pike insisted the building had been empty since afternoon. Holmes touched the burner. Recently lit, a floorboard creaked beyond the partition. Lestrade burst in from the front with 2 constables. "No one passed us," he said. "Then someone remains ahead of us," Holmes replied. Pike led them down a narrow stair. At its foot stood an iron door bearing 64 engraved squares. The key found beneath the stage fitted its lock. Beyond lay a circular chamber, whose stone floor had been painted as a vast chessboard. Upon the central square stood an iron king, 6 feet high, and fixed to a broad pedestal. Around the walls were shelves of ledgers, sealed boxes, and numbered envelopes. Lestrade whistled softly. Harcourt's little treasury. Holmes walked once around the king. On its base were 2 keyholes, one bright with recent scratches, and the other thick with dust. "Where does the second key belong?" he asked. Pike shook his head. There was only one. "Then there are 2 mechanisms, one known and one concealed." Holmes inserted the brass key into the scratched lock. It turned halfway and stopped. At once, a shutter slammed across the entrance, separating them from Lestrade's constables. Gas began hissing from 4 vents near the ceiling. Watson smelled bitter almonds. "Prussic acid?" "Not yet," Holmes said. "The odor is an imitation intended to provoke panic. Hold your breath, nevertheless." Pike threw himself against the shutter. Lestrade cursed and fired his revolver into the lock, but the bullet flattened against the iron. Holmes remained beside the king, watching the floor. "The trap requires weight," he said. "We entered as 3 men, and triggered nothing. Lestrade made 4. You chose a charming moment for arithmetic," Lestrade snapped. "The murderer chose it." Holmes pointed to 4 dark squares surrounding the pedestal. Each had sunk slightly beneath their feet. He ordered them to step together onto white squares. The hissing ceased. "Pressure plates," Pike said. "I never installed them." "No, but you recognize the workmanship." Pike's silence was answer enough. Holmes withdrew the key and inserted it into the dusty lock. This time the pedestal opened. Inside lay a ledger wrapped in green cloth and a small wax cylinder labeled in Harcourt's hand, Confession 1-1. Before Holmes could take it, a shot cracked from the gallery above. The lantern shattered. In darkness, someone rushed past Watson, snatched the cylinder, and struck Pike to the floor. Holmes sprang toward the sound. A panel banged shut, and footsteps fled within the wall. Lestrade relit a lamp. Pike lay bleeding from the temple, while the ledger remained untouched. Holmes opened it. Every page was blank except the last, upon which one sentence had been written: "The white pawn was never inside the machine." Watson stared at the words. "But we all saw it." "Yes," said Holmes, studying the empty compartment where the cylinder had lain. "And therefore someone needed us to believe it had been there." From within the wall came a muffled cry, abruptly cut short. Holmes seized the lamp. "Our thief has met another player," he said, and plunged into the hidden passage without hesitation. The passage was scarcely wide enough for a man's shoulders. Its brick walls sweated with moisture, and the stale air carried the mingled odors of lamp oil, plaster, and something metallic. Holmes advanced rapidly, holding the relit lamp low so that its glow swept the floor ahead. Watson followed with Lestrade at his heels, while Pike, despite the blood at his temple, insisted upon coming behind them. The cry had seemed near, yet the passage twisted twice before they found its source. A man lay crumpled beside an iron ladder, one hand clutching his throat. He wore a long brown coat and a low felt hat. The stolen wax cylinder had rolled against the wall. Watson knelt. The stranger was alive, but barely. A thin cord had cut deeply into his neck. "Garrot," said Lestrade. His accomplice silenced him. Holmes raised the man's hand. The fingers were stained with printer's ink, and beneath one nail lay a thread of green sealing wax. "Not an ordinary accomplice," Holmes murmured. "This fellow prepared labels, notes, and perhaps the envelope addressed to me." The injured man's eyelids fluttered. Holmes bent close. "Who employed you?" The lips moved without sound. Then, with a desperate effort, he whispered one word: "Bishop." His hand opened. In the palm rested a tiny brass chess bishop, flattened on one side like a key. The man shuddered and lost consciousness. "He may recover," Watson said, "if we get him into fresh air immediately." Lestrade summoned the constables, who had forced the shutter from the other side. While they carried the stranger away, Holmes fitted the brass bishop into a narrow slot beside the ladder. A concealed catch released, and a section of brickwork swung inward. Beyond it stood a cramped room containing a desk, a phonograph, several masks, and a wardrobe of coats. Upon the desk lay printed cards identical to the warning pinned upon Vale. There were also scraps of waxed silk and a jar of animal blood. Lestrade's eyes brightened. "There is our workshop." The man in brown arranged everything. "Everything visible," said Holmes. He examined the phonograph. Its cylinder carriage was empty, but beside it stood a speaking tube leading upward. Pike pointed to the wall. "That tube reaches the demonstration chamber, so the voice which questioned Vale in the carriage may have been transmitted rather than spoken by someone beside him," Watson suggested. Holmes nodded. "And the deliberate pauses arose because the speaker listened for replies through a second tube." Lestrade searched the desk and found a packet of banknotes tied with green ribbon. Beneath them lay a letter signed with the initials G.P. Pike's face hardened. "My initials," he said. The letter instructed the man in brown to follow Vale, recover Harcourt's score sheet, and direct Holmes toward the chess vault. Payment was promised after midnight. Lestrade folded it carefully. "That settles the matter." "It settles that someone wished it to settle the matter," Holmes replied. "You deny the evidence because it is plain. I distrust it because it is excessively plain." He took Pike's right hand and compared it with the writing. "The formation of the capitals is similar, but the pressure is wrong." Pike writes with a mechanic's heavy downward stroke. This hand hesitates at every curve. Pike exhaled, though fear remained in his eyes. Holmes returned to the fallen cylinder. Its wax surface had been scratched by the attack but not destroyed. He set it upon the phonograph and turned the handle slowly. Harcourt's voice emerged beneath a veil of crackling. "The second confession is this. The automaton did not murder me." The machine clicked, and the recording continued. "If I am dead when these words are heard, seek the player who changed the time of the game. The 23rd move was not played at 8:42. It was played at 8:36. The cylinder ended. Watson looked at Holmes. 6 minutes. "What difference can that make?" "The difference between an alibi and a noose." Lestrade produced the official program. "The match began at 8. Witnesses placed the murder at 8:42. "Because the hall clock showed it," said Holmes, "and because the program predicted 40 minutes for the exhibition." A sharp report sounded overhead. Pike reeled, clutching his shoulder. A bullet had passed through the speaking tube and struck him from behind. Holmes extinguished the lamp at once. In darkness, footsteps raced above them. "Watson, attend to Pike. Lestrade, guard the cylinder. And you." But Holmes was already climbing the iron ladder toward the unseen gunman. At the top he paused only long enough to call down, "The clock, gentlemen." Find who wound the clock. Then the trapdoor closed above him. A moment later, another shot echoed through the building, followed by the crash of breaking glass above them. Watson heard Holmes cross the room above very rapidly. Then came the scrape of a sash, the crash of glass, and a fading rattle upon the roof. Lestrade made for the ladder, but Watson caught his arm. "Pike first. A severed artery will solve the case by killing the wrong man." The bullet had passed through the fleshy part of Pike's shoulder. While Watson bound it, the inventor stared at the dark trapdoor. "He knew where I stood," Pike whispered. "The shot came through the tube as though the fellow had watched us." "There may be another aperture," said Lestrade. "There is none. I built these walls." Watson remembered Holmes' warning. Then he did not watch us. He knew where the tube ended and expected Pike to stand beside it. Lestrade gave him a grudging nod. They carried Pike into the vault, where the constables guarded the wounded man in brown. 5 minutes later, Holmes returned through the iron door, coat torn and cheek bleeding from a splinter. "He escaped across the roofs," said Lestrade. "He reached a carriage prepared in Soho Square. I obtained something more useful than his person." Holmes opened his hand. Upon his palm lay a curved shard of watch glass and a shred of dark blue cloth. "From his sleeve?" Watson asked. "From the hand with which he climbed. The glass was already embedded in the cloth before he broke tonight's window." Holmes turned to Pike. "Who maintained the hall clock at St. James's?" "Abel March, Sir Claudius's steward. He winds every clock in the building before exhibitions. And tonight," Pike frowned. "March reported ill. Miss Meriton wound it in his place." "Sir Claudius's daughter," Lestrade exclaimed. "Eleanor Meriton," Pike said. "She supervised the reception because her father was occupied with Harcourt." Holmes' eyes gleamed briefly. "We returned to the hall. They left 2 constables with Pike and the prisoner, then drove through streets thinning toward dawn." Holmes remained silent until Watson asked whether Eleanor's supposed letters made her a suspect. "Every person connected with Harcourt is a suspect," Holmes answered. "But motive without method is a beggar without boots." At St. James's Hall, Sir Claudius waited under guard. Beside him stood a tall young woman in a dark travelling cloak. Her face was composed, but one gloved hand gripped the back of a chair. "My daughter," Sir Claudius said. "She came when she heard of the attack upon Pike." Holmes bowed. "Did you wind the hall clock this evening, Miss Meriton?" "I did." "At what time?" "Shortly before 7. "Did you alter it?" Her eyes flashed. "No." Holmes produced the blue cloth. "Do you recognize this? It resembles the livery worn by our attendants." Sir Claudius turned angrily. "Half the hall wears blue." "Not with watch glass sewn inside the cuff," Holmes said. He crossed to the clock fixed above the gallery. A constable brought a ladder. Holmes climbed, opened the case, and removed a narrow strip of brass wedged behind the minute wheel. "This caused the hands to lose 6 minutes between 8 and 9, he explained. At 9, the strip slipped free, and the clock resumed normally. Lestrade looked toward Eleanor. "You had access." "So had every servant," she replied. Holmes descended and examined her gloves. "Your right glove is new. The left is worn. A tear required replacement." "Where is the torn glove?" "I burned it." Sir Claudius stepped between them. "This is intolerable." Before Lestrade could answer, a constable entered carrying a small dispatch box recovered from Harcourt's dressing room. Its lock had been opened with the brass key. Inside were Eleanor's letters, bound in ribbon, and beneath them lay a pocket watch, stopped at 8:36. Its crystal was shattered. Lestrade placed the blue shred beside it. The fibers matched perfectly. Eleanor's composure broke. "I went to Harcourt's room," she said. "I took back my letters, but he was alive when I left him." "At what time?" Holmes asked. 8:35. "Then you lied about never seeing him alone." "I feared scandal." "And the broken watch?" "He seized my wrist. I struck him with it and fled." Lestrade moved toward her, but Holmes raised a hand. "The evidence is persuasive, Inspector, which is precisely why you should distrust it." He opened Harcourt's watch and studied the mechanism. This watch was stopped by removing its balance spring, not by the blow which broke the glass. It was prepared to accuse Miss Meriton. Eleanor sank into the chair. Holmes turned the watch over. Scratched inside the case were 2 words, Black Bishop. At that moment, the hall clock began to chime, though its hands stood at 12 minutes past 1. From inside the automaton came Harcourt's recorded laughter. Then the wooden prince raised its arm and pointed directly at Sir Claudius. Sir Claudius recoiled as though the wooden finger had become a pistol. "Stop that infernal thing!" Pike was absent, wounded at the mechanical rooms, and no engineer stood near the cabinet. Yet the automaton's arm remained extended, its brass forefinger fixed upon the old gentleman's breast. Harcourt's laughter crackled once more from within, and then faded into the grinding of gears. Holmes stepped between Sir Claudius and the machine. "Do not touch it," he said. Lestrade glanced toward the doors. "Someone must be operating it." "Certainly. The question is whether the operator stands in this hall." Holmes lowered himself beside the chess table. The white pawn still rested upon Bishop 7, where he had placed it earlier. He lifted it. At once the automaton's arm fell lifelessly to its side. "A pressure contact," Watson said. "A delayed electrical circuit," Holmes corrected. The pawn completed it. The pointing gesture was prepared before we arrived. Sir Claudius stared at the machine. "Prepared to accuse me? Prepared to frighten you?" Holmes turned sharply. "What is the Black Bishop?" The old man's face altered. Eleanor rose from her chair. "Father, tell him." For some moments Sir Claudius seemed unable to speak. Then he walked to the edge of the platform and looked out across the empty seats. "It was the name of a private chess society," he said. 12 members, all wealthy men. Harcourt organized it 6 years ago. The games were merely a disguise. We wagered upon political appointments, railway contracts, court decisions, matters which certain members influenced beforehand. Lestrade gave a low whistle. "Corruption, folly," Sir Claudius replied bitterly. "At first. Later, blackmail. Harcourt kept records of every wager and every favor. No man could withdraw without risking ruin." "Who was the 13th member?" Holmes asked. "There were only 12. There are always 13 when 12 conspirators require a keeper of secrets." Sir Claudius looked toward the automaton. "Abel March, my steward, carried messages and maintained the clocks. Harcourt called him the pawn." Holmes' expression remained still, but Watson saw his eyes brighten. "And March was ill tonight?" "So I believed." Eleanor spoke quickly. "He sent word through a boy at noon." "Describe the boy." "I scarcely noticed him. Brown coat, ink upon his fingers." "The man found in the passage," Watson said. Holmes nodded. "A messenger hired to impersonate a messenger. March's illness was manufactured." Lestrade moved toward the door. "Then we arrest March. You may search for him," Holmes said, "but you will not find him at his lodging." "How can you know?" "Because Vale's boots have become important." The remark astonished everyone except Holmes. He asked for a constable and dispatched him to Baker Street with instructions to bring Vale and the boots untouched. Then he returned to the automaton. "Sir Claudius, who arranged the match?" "Harcourt insisted upon it." "And who chose the 23rd move as the point of death?" "No one. The game determined it." "No," Holmes said. "The game was forced." He rearranged several pieces, restoring the position before Harcourt's final knight move. Black's responses narrowed white toward one dramatic sacrifice. Harcourt knew the machine's combinations and selected knight to f7 because it appeared brilliant. The blade was released not by time alone, but by pressure upon that square. Lestrade frowned. "Then anyone who altered the mechanism could predict the move. Only someone with Harcourt's prepared analysis." Eleanor approached the board. "But Harcourt said the automaton did not murder him. He meant that the blade did not kill him." Watson felt a chill despite the warm hall. "I examined the wound only after the body had been removed," he said. "You noticed something before me." "I noticed the blood. A blade entering a living heart produces a pattern different from blood poured upon clothing after circulation has nearly ceased. Harcourt was dying before the machine struck." Sir Claudius gripped the platform rail. "Then where was he attacked?" "In his dressing room, at 8:36, said Holmes. The watch told the correct time, though someone later disabled it and planted it among Miss Meriton's letters. A constable entered hurriedly. Mr. Holmes, a telegram from the hospital. The man in the brown coat has regained consciousness. He gave a name before collapsing again. Lestrade seized the paper and read aloud. Abel March. Sir Claudius shook his head. Impossible. That man was not March. No, Holmes said. He was hired by March, attacked by March, and instructed to speak March's name if captured. Then March is our murderer. Holmes looked toward the silent wooden prince. March is the hand, he replied. I am seeking the mind. From beneath the chessboard came a soft click. A hidden drawer slid open, revealing a black bishop and a fresh scrap of paper. Upon it were written 5 words. Watson dies next before dawn. Holmes read the message twice, then held it toward the nearest gas jet. The paper was ordinary, but the ink had not dried. Our opponent is close, said Watson. Closer than that. He placed this after we entered. Lestrade ordered every door secured. Constables searched the galleries, corridors, dressing rooms and cellar, while Holmes examined the drawer. The black bishop fitted a groove in its base. When turned, it released the spring which had delivered the warning. A mechanism prepared in advance, Lestrade said. The mechanism, yes. Not the message. Observe the blot where the final word was folded too soon. Watson glanced across the empty hall and felt the peculiar sensation of being watched by an intelligence which had measured not merely their actions, but Holmes's probable conclusions. Sir Claudius insisted that Watson leave under guard. Holmes refused. A threat is valuable evidence. Remove Watson, and we discard the one appointment our adversary has kept. You propose to use him as bait? Eleanor demanded. With his consent. You have it, Watson said. Holmes nodded, though his eyes softened for an instant. The constable sent to Baker Street returned before 2, bringing Edmund Vale and the mud-stained boots. Vale appeared exhausted but eager to assist. Holmes placed the boots beneath a lamp and cut away the lining of the left heel. From within, he drew a wafer of metal, no larger than a sixpence, pierced by 2 holes and wound with black silk. Vale stared. I have never seen it. It was fixed there while you were unconscious, Holmes said. Each step tightened the silk. After a measured distance, the thread released a capsule hidden beneath the heel. He broke open the heel and revealed traces of powder. Plaster, Watson said. The same plaster scattered from the carriage. Whoever abducted Vale intended us to follow a trail toward the demolition works. Yet the trail ended because he removed his coat and was thrown from the carriage early. Lestrade frowned. Then why tamper with his boot? To create a false route if he escaped later. Our enemy prepares alternatives. Holmes turned the metal wafer over. Upon its underside was stamped the maker's mark of Pike's workshop. That proves Pike supplied it, Lestrade said. It proves it was manufactured in his establishment. A kitchen knife does not accuse the cook, Holmes asked Vale, who had access to Pike's stores. The secretary listed apprentices, servants, Sir Claudius, Harcourt, and Abel March, who maintained the automaton between exhibitions. At March's name, Holmes smiled without pleasure. The hand again. A constable entered to report that the hall was empty. No concealed person had been found, though a skylight above the gallery stood open. Holmes checked his watch. 3 minutes to 2. Watson, sit where Harcourt sat. Sir Claudius protested, but Watson crossed to the blood-stained chair. Holmes placed the black bishop upon the board and extinguished every lamp except one above the platform. Lestrade and his men hid behind the curtains. Eleanor and her father were taken to the wings. Vale crouched beneath the gallery. The automaton faced Watson in silence. 2 o'clock struck. Nothing happened. Then Watson heard a faint ticking beneath his chair. Holmes, standing in shadow, raised one finger, forbidding movement. The ticking accelerated. From the automaton's eyes shone 2 red points. A voice whispered from inside the cabinet. Dr. Watson, move the bishop. Watson kept still. The voice came again, urgent. Move it, or Holmes dies. Across the hall, a pistol fired. The surviving lamp burst, plunging them into darkness. Watson felt a cord tighten around his ankle and jerk his leg beneath the chair. He fell as a steel dart passed where his chest had been. Constables rushed from hiding. Someone ran along the gallery. Lestrade shouted, and a second shot answered him. Holmes struck a match. The black bishop had vanished. "Do not pursue," he called. "Guard the stage door." But Vale was already racing toward the gallery stairs. A shadow dropped from the balcony, landed behind him, and raised a length of wire. Watson shouted. Vale turned too late. Holmes hurled his matchbox. It struck the attacker's wrist, spoiling the blow. Lestrade seized the figure, and together they dragged him beneath a relighted lamp. The prisoner was Abel March. He wore the dark blue coat of a hall attendant. Around one sleeve, beneath a tear, glittered fragments of watch glass. March looked not at Lestrade but at Holmes. "You are still one move behind," he said. Holmes searched him and found the missing bishop, a pistol, and a key marked with Sir Claudius's crest. "Where is the mind?" Holmes asked. March smiled. "In Baker Street." At that instant, Vale gave a cry. Holmes's face changed. "Mrs. Hudson," he said. Without waiting for Lestrade, he sprang toward the door. The hansom tore northward through the thinning fog, Holmes leaning from the window to urge the driver onward. Watson sat opposite him, revolver drawn, while Lestrade followed in a second cab with March under guard. "You believe him?" Watson asked. "I believe that he wished us to hurry to Baker Street. Then it may be another trap." "Undoubtedly." They reached 221B to find the street quiet. No lamp burned in Mrs. Hudson's parlor, but a pale light showed behind the curtains of the sitting room above. The front door stood ajar. Holmes entered without sound. Upon the first stair lay Mrs. Hudson's keyring. Upon the second rested a white pawn. Upon the third, a black bishop. "A trail," Watson whispered. "A command," Holmes replied. "Pawn before bishop. The servant precedes the master." From above came the slow scrape of a chair. Holmes climbed with his back against the wall. Watson followed. The sitting-room door was open, and within, beside the fire, Mrs. Hudson sat bound but unharmed. Behind her stood Gideon Pike, his wounded arm in a sling and a pistol in his left hand. Upon Holmes's table lay Harcourt's score-sheet, the green ledger, and the wax cylinder recovered from the vault. Pike smiled weakly. "You came faster than March predicted." "So March was your hand," said Holmes. "My tool, no more loyal than any other mechanism." Watson raised his revolver, but Pike pressed the pistol against Mrs. Hudson's temple. "Put it down, Doctor." Watson obeyed. Holmes remained in the doorway. "You escaped from the constable by using the speaking tube concealed in the infirmary wall. By bribing him. Simpler methods are sometimes best. And the wound in your shoulder. March's error." He fired too low. Holmes glanced at the objects upon the table. "You came for Harcourt's final confession. I came to destroy it. Then you do not know what it contains." For the first time, Pike's composure shifted. Holmes drew the wax cylinder from his pocket. "The object upon the table is a copy." Pike's pistol moved from Mrs. Hudson toward Holmes. "Give it to me. Release her." Pike laughed. "You are in no position to bargain. On the contrary, March has been captured. The man in brown can identify you, and your machines speak more clearly than your witnesses. You have no proof that I killed Harcourt. I have the game." Holmes stepped into the room. "You built the Automaton's answering system. Harcourt discovered that you had secretly altered it to influence private wagers. He threatened to expose you and the Black Bishop Society. You therefore prepared a murder that would appear to occur publicly at 8:42, while Harcourt had actually received a fatal wound 6 minutes earlier in his dressing room." Pike's pale eyes narrowed. "Eleanor struck Harcourt with the watch and fled. You entered immediately afterward through the service passage. You stabbed him with a narrow blade, then used a stimulant to keep him conscious long enough to walk onto the stage." Watson stared. "Then Harcourt was alive during the game?" "Dying, but alive. He knew his death was certain. That is why he played the prepared knight move and allowed Pike's machine to strike him. The public wound concealed the private one." Pike shook his head. "A pleasing tale. The score sheet proves it. Harcourt's handwriting deteriorates after the 17th move, not the 23rd. His final notation was written by another hand. Vale recorded the moves, but you replaced the sheet during the confusion." Holmes held up the genuine paper. Near the bottom, one line slanted sharply downward. Harcourt wrote one last message beneath the moves. "Pike altered the clock. You tore away the lower strip, but printer's ink upon your thumb transferred to the edge." Pike glanced involuntarily at his stained hand. That instant was enough. Mrs. Hudson threw herself sideways. Holmes struck Pike's wrist with the poker, and Watson sprang forward. The pistol discharged into the ceiling. Pike fell, but before Lestrade reached the room, he twisted free and hurled the green ledger into the fire. Holmes seized it with the tongs. Several pages blackened, yet one sealed packet dropped from the binding. Pike stared at it in horror. Holmes broke the seal. Inside was a photograph of Pike and Abel March standing beside the open automaton, the dagger mechanism clearly visible between them. Lestrade entered and placed a hand upon Pike's shoulder. "Checkmate," said Watson. "No," Holmes replied, studying the photograph's reverse. "Only check. Harcourt has named a third player." On the back, beneath Harcourt's signature, appeared an address in Limehouse and tomorrow's date. Below it, he had written, "The Black Bishop moves only when the Queen commands." Holmes looked toward the window, where dawn grayed. "We have arrested the engineer," he said. "Now we must find his sovereign." The address led them to a deserted counting house above a riverside warehouse in Limehouse. The fog had thinned to a grey veil, and beyond the windows, the Thames moved like beaten lead. Holmes entered with Watson and Lestrade, leaving Pike and March under guard in cabs. The room contained a chess table, 13 chairs, and an iron stove filled with half-burned papers. Upon the board, every black piece had been removed except the Queen. "Nothing has been overlooked," Lestrade muttered. "On the contrary," said Holmes, "something has been left because its owner believes it explains too much." He lifted the Queen. Beneath it lay a key bearing Sir Claudius's crest, and a note ordering Abel March to admit Pike to Harcourt's dressing room at 8:35. Lestrade smiled. "Then Meryton commanded them." "A convincing conclusion," Holmes replied, "and therefore incomplete." He placed the note near the stove. "The paper is from St. James's Hall, the seal from Sir Claudius's desk, and the key from his household. But the writing was made by someone who habitually forms the letter R, like a chess knight, Miss Eleanor Meryton." Watson stared at him. Eleanor was the Queen. The door opened behind them. Eleanor stood upon the threshold with a small pistol in her hand. Sir Claudius was beside her, bewildered. "I begged her not to come," he said. "You followed because she told you Holmes meant to arrest you," said Watson. Holmes faced the young woman. "You ordered Pike to alter the clock and March to admit him. You intended Harcourt to die before the public blade struck." Eleanor's composure did not break. "He was destroying my father. He was blackmailing him. But your motive went beyond filial devotion. Harcourt possessed the Black Bishop ledgers. If exposed, they would have shown that you, not Sir Claudius, selected the confidential information upon which the society wagered." Sir Claudius recoiled. "Eleanor?" She turned upon him. "You signed what I placed before you. You never asked how the predictions proved correct." Holmes continued. "Pike altered the automaton's combinations, March controlled the clocks and passages, and you supplied knowledge obtained through your father's correspondence. Harcourt discovered the scheme and demanded control. You decided upon murder." "The machine was to bear the blame," Watson said. "Not. The machine created confusion, while the false clues accused Pike, then March, then Sir Claudius. Each was guilty enough to appear capable of everything." Eleanor raised the pistol. "And Harcourt's first confession. The pawn was never inside the machine because you placed it in the cabinet after Harcourt examined it. You needed Holmes to find the hidden panel and follow the path you prepared. Harcourt, however, had anticipated you. He hollowed the night, recorded the cylinders, and marked the time upon his watch." "But Pike stabbed him," Lestrade said, "at Eleanor's command. She entered first, recovered her letters, and broke the watch deliberately. Pike followed through the service passage and delivered the fatal wound. Harcourt survived by force of will long enough to make the final night move. His public death became his accusation." Sir Claudius covered his face. Eleanor's pistol shifted toward Holmes. "You still have only deductions." Holmes drew Harcourt's last cylinder from his pocket. "Then let the dead man supply testimony." He placed it upon a phonograph found beside the stove. Harcourt's weakened voice filled the room. "The Queen is Eleanor Meryton. Pike is her bishop. March is her pawn. If I die, the move at 8:36 proves the game." Eleanor fired. Watson struck her arm upward, and the bullet buried itself in the ceiling. Lestrade seized her before she could fire again. For one instant she struggled, then her strength failed, and she stood silent while the handcuffs closed. Sir Claudius looked 20 years older. I would have borne disgrace for her. She relied upon that, Holmes said. Weeks later, Pike and March confessed in exchange for lesser charges, while the Black Bishop records sent several distinguished gentlemen into retirement and others before the courts. Sir Claudius resigned from public life. Eleanor was convicted of conspiracy and murder. One evening, Watson found Holmes studying the white pawn beside the fire. "You knew she was the queen before Limehouse," Watson said. "I suspected her when she claimed to have burned the torn glove. Innocent persons conceal scandals. Guilty persons manufacture evidence. The mismatched gloves, the altered clock, and the key bearing her father's crest formed a pattern of protection disguised as accusation. And Harcourt? A blackmailer who arranged justice only when death denied him profit." Holmes tossed the pawn into the coal scuttle. "Machines do not murder, Watson. They merely obey. It is the human hand which moves the piece, and the human mind which chooses the square." Outside, London's clocks struck together, and none of them had lost a minute.